The red clay soil of Cu Chi district, northwest of Saigon, concealed one of the most elaborate defensive networks ever constructed in modern warfare. Beneath the rubber plantations and rice paddies, the Viet Cong had spent years carving out a subterranean world that would challenge every assumption American and Allied commanders held about how to fight an insurgency. These tunnels were not simple foxholes or trenches. They were multi-level labyrinths stretching for miles, deep enough to survive B-52 bombing runs, complex enough to house field hospitals, printing presses, sleeping quarters, and command centers. The tunnel systems allowed Viet Cong fighters to vanish after ambushes, to appear behind American lines without warning, and to endure artillery barrages that turned the surface into a moonscape while they waited safely below. By early 1966, American intelligence had begun to grasp the scale of what lay beneath the Iron Triangle and the surrounding areas, but understanding the problem and solving it were vastly different challenges. The Iron Triangle was a roughly triangular area of dense jungle and abandoned plantations bounded by the Saigon River to the southwest, the Tin River to the east, and Route 13 to the west, about 25 miles northwest of Saigon. The region had been a Viet Minh stronghold during the war against the French, and when the Viet Cong resumed armed struggle in the early 1960s, they returned to these same areas. The tunnels had been dug initially in the late 1940s as shelter from French artillery and air attacks. Over the following decade, the network expanded dramatically. By 1965, some sections had 3 levels, with the deepest passages more than 30 feet underground. Ventilation shafts were cleverly disguised. Entrances were hidden under vegetation, inside termite mounds, beneath cooking fires, or submerged in streams. Trapdoors were designed to be nearly invisible even to soldiers standing directly on them. The tunnels themselves were narrow, typically only about 2 feet wide and 3 feet high, forcing anyone moving through them to crawl or crouch. This was by design. The Viet Cong fighters were generally smaller in stature than American soldiers, and the confined spaces gave them a significant advantage in any underground confrontation. Throughout 1965, American units operating in the areas around Cu Chi and the Iron Triangle reported increasingly strange encounters. Patrols would take fire and then find no trace of the enemy. Bases would be mortared from positions that, when assaulted, revealed nothing but empty jungle. Soldiers would step on ground that sounded hollow, or notice faint cooking smells rising from the earth. Intelligence officers began to suspect that the Viet Cong were not simply hiding in the jungle, but living beneath it. Captured documents and interrogations of prisoners confirmed that the tunnels were far more extensive than anyone had imagined. The decision was made to launch a major operation to locate and destroy the tunnel networks in the Hobo Woods, a heavily forested area adjacent to the Iron Triangle. The operation would be called Crimp, and it would involve the largest concentration of American and Allied forces yet committed to a single mission in the war. Planning for Operation Crimp began in late December 1965. The mission would involve elements of the U.S. 1st Infantry Division, the 173rd Airborne Brigade, and the 1st Battalion of the Royal Australian Regiment, along with supporting artillery, engineer, and aviation units. The total force numbered approximately 8,000 troops. The objective was to sweep through the Hobo Woods, locate and engage the Viet Cong 9th Division, and destroy the tunnel infrastructure that allowed the enemy to operate so effectively in the region. Intelligence estimates suggested that several Viet Cong battalions were using the area as a base, and that significant supply caches and command facilities were hidden underground. The operation was scheduled to begin on January 8, 1966, with a massive preparatory bombardment followed by helicopter insertions and ground advances. The opening phase of Operation Crimp followed the standard American doctrine of the time. Artillery batteries fired hundreds of high-explosive rounds into the target area throughout the night of January 7th. At dawn on January 8th, tactical aircraft delivered bombs and napalm across the Hobo Woods. The intention was to destroy enemy positions and force the Viet Cong into the open, where superior American firepower could annihilate them. Helicopters then lifted infantry units into landing zones carved out of the jungle. The soldiers expected to find devastation, perhaps scattered resistance, and then to sweep through the area methodically. What they found instead was an eerie quiet. The jungle was torn and scorched, but there were no bodies, no blood trails, no sign that anyone had been present at all. As the troops began moving through the undergrowth, they started taking casualties. Soldiers stepped on mines. Others triggered tripwires that released sharpened bamboo stakes, known as punji sticks, often smeared with feces to cause infection. Some traps were more elaborate, involving concealed pits or rigged grenades. The Viet Cong were not gone. They were below, waiting. The first tunnel entrance was discovered by accident when an Australian soldier stepped on a section of ground that gave way slightly beneath his boot. Brushing aside leaves and dirt revealed a wooden trapdoor, expertly camouflaged. The Australians called for engineers and began a cautious exploration. The entrance led down a narrow shaft into complete darkness. The air was stale and thick. The tunnel extended in multiple directions, with side passages and junctions that suggested a far larger network than anyone had anticipated. Word spread quickly through the units in the area, and within hours, dozens more entrances had been located. It became clear that the American and Australian forces were not on top of a few scattered bunkers. They were standing on a vast underground city. The task of exploring these tunnels fell to a small group of volunteers who would come to be known as tunnel rats. There was no official training program for this role in early 1966. The job required soldiers who were small enough to fit through the cramped passages, brave enough to enter a pitch-black space where the enemy might be waiting around any corner, and calm enough to navigate booby traps and dead ends without panicking. Most tunnel rats were drawn from engineer units or infantry companies, and many were chosen simply because they were short and wiry. The standard equipment was minimal. A tunnel rat would typically carry a flashlight, a pistol, a knife, and sometimes a length of rope or communication wire. The pistol was usually a .45 caliber M1911 or a .38 caliber revolver. Rifles were too long and cumbersome for the tight spaces. Some tunnel rats preferred not to carry a flashlight at all, reasoning that the light would only make them a target. They would crawl forward in total darkness, feeling their way along the walls, listening for the sound of breathing or movement ahead. Among the Australian forces, Captain Sandy McGregor of the 1st Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, took a leading role in organizing the exploration and mapping of the tunnels. McGregor was an engineer officer with a methodical approach to the problem. He understood that simply throwing grenades into tunnel entrances or pumping in tear gas was not enough. To truly neutralize the network, they needed to understand its layout, identify key facilities, and systematically destroy them. McGregor and his team began descending into the tunnels with notebooks, compasses, and measuring tapes. They sketched maps as they went, noting junctions, storage rooms, ventilation shafts, and defensive positions. The work was slow and dangerous. The tunnels were often less than 3 feet high, forcing the men to crawl on their bellies. The heat was oppressive, and the air was thick with dust and the smell of earth and decay. Every corner could conceal a Viet Cong soldier with a rifle or a grenade, Every step could trigger a booby trap. The Viet Cong had designed the tunnels with defense in mind. At key junctions, there were firing positions where a single defender could hold off multiple attackers. Some passages had sharp turns that prevented grenades from being thrown far. Others had trapdoors that could be sealed from below, trapping intruders in dead-end sections. The enemy also used psychological tactics. They would leave behind false trails, dead ends filled with snakes or scorpions, or chambers rigged with explosives set to detonate when disturbed. In some cases, the Viet Cong would wait silently in side passages, allowing the tunnel rats to pass, then attack from behind or seal off exits. The result was a series of tense, claustrophobic firefights in near-total darkness. Soldiers described the experience as the most terrifying of their lives. The sound of gunfire in a confined tunnel was deafening. The muzzle flash from a pistol would blind a man for several seconds. There was no room to maneuver, no cover, and no way to call for help if something went wrong. American units employed different tactics. Some commanders ordered their men to avoid entering the tunnels altogether, instead using explosives, tear gas, or acetylene to destroy or seal the entrances. Engineer teams would pump CS gas, a riot control agent, into the tunnels, hoping to force the Viet Cong to the surface. In practice, this was often ineffective. The tunnel networks had multiple ventilation shafts and exits, and the gas would dissipate or be vented away before it could do significant harm. The Viet Cong also had gas masks and wet cloths to protect themselves. Another method was to use what soldiers called the blow-and-go technique. Engineers would place explosive charges at tunnel entrances or in chambers they had explored, then detonate them to collapse the passages. This worked in some cases, but the tunnels were often deep enough and well constructed enough to withstand all but the largest blasts. Soldiers would return days later to find that the Viet Cong had already dug out the rubble and reopened the passages. As Operation Crimp progressed, the scale of the underground network became more apparent. By January 10th, Australian and American forces had uncovered what they estimated to be around 10 miles of interconnected tunnels. Some sections were clearly living quarters, with sleeping mats, cooking utensils, and personal belongings. Others were storage areas filled with rice, ammunition, medical supplies, and documents. One chamber contained a field hospital with surgical instruments, bandages, and bottles of medicine. Another held a printing press used to produce propaganda leaflets. There were workshops where weapons were repaired, classrooms where political instruction was given, and even a small theater where entertainment was staged for the troops. The tunnels were not just a hiding place. They were a fully functioning military base, hidden entirely underground. The human cost of exploring these tunnels was significant. Several American and Australian soldiers were killed or wounded in underground firefights. Others were injured by booby traps or collapsed tunnels. In at least one documented case, a soldier suffocated after becoming disoriented and lost in a dead-end passage. The psychological toll was equally severe. Many tunnel rats suffered from what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder. The experience of crawling through pitch-black tunnels, knowing that death could come at any moment from any direction, left lasting scars. Some men refused to enter the tunnels after their first experience. Others became obsessed with the work, volunteering repeatedly despite the danger. The Viet Cong also suffered heavily during Operation Crimp. Exact casualty figures are difficult to verify, but American and Australian reports claimed that several hundred enemy fighters were killed, either in the tunnels or in surface engagements. Large quantities of weapons, ammunition, and supplies were captured or destroyed. Documents seized in the tunnels provided valuable intelligence about Viet Cong plans and organization. However, the operation did not achieve its ultimate goal. The tunnel network was too vast and too resilient to be eliminated by conventional means. For every entrance that was destroyed, the Viet Cong would dig another. For every section that was cleared, they would retreat to deeper levels or adjacent tunnels. By the time Operation Crimp officially ended on January 14, 1966, the American and Australian commanders had to acknowledge that while they had inflicted damage, they had not defeated the tunnels. The lessons learned during Operation Crimp led to changes in American tactics. The Army began to develop more specialized training for tunnel rats, though the role remained largely a volunteer position. Equipment improved slightly with better flashlights, communication devices, and protective gear. Some units experimented with trained dogs to detect tunnel entrances or to enter the tunnels ahead of soldiers, though this had limited success. The dogs were often too large for the narrow passages, and the darkness and confined spaces made them difficult to control. Engineers developed new demolition techniques, including the use of shaped charges designed to collapse tunnels more effectively. Chemical warfare agents were used more extensively, though with mixed results and growing controversy. The most significant change was a shift in strategy. Rather than attempting to clear every tunnel, American forces focused on denying the Viet Cong access to key areas by establishing permanent bases, conducting frequent patrols, and using roam plows, large armored bulldozers, to clear vegetation and expose tunnel entrances. Despite these efforts, the tunnels remained a critical asset for the Viet Cong throughout the war. The Cu Chi Tunnel Network, in particular, continued to grow and evolve. By 1968, it stretched for more than 150 miles, with some sections extending all the way to the outskirts of Saigon. During the Tet Offensive in January and February of 1968, Viet Cong forces used the tunnels to infiltrate close to American and South Vietnamese positions, launch surprise attacks, and then withdraw before reinforcements could arrive. The tunnels allowed them to move troops and supplies without being detected by aerial reconnaissance or ground patrols. They also provided safe havens where fighters could rest, regroup, and plan their next operations. The story of the tunnel rats is one of extraordinary courage in the face of almost unimaginable danger. These soldiers, often young men in their late teens or early 20s, volunteered to enter a hostile environment where every advantage lay with the enemy. They fought battles in darkness, in spaces so confined that they could barely move, against an opponent who knew every twist and turn of the terrain. They did so with minimal equipment, limited support, and little recognition. Many of their names are not recorded in official histories. Their actions were often classified or simply overlooked in the broader narrative of the war. Yet their contribution was vital. The intelligence they gathered, the facilities they destroyed, and the enemy fighters they engaged all played a role in the larger struggle for control of South Vietnam. The tunnels themselves stand as a testament to the determination and ingenuity of the Viet Cong. Built with simple tools, often by hand, over the course of decades, they represented a form of warfare that was uniquely suited to the conditions of Vietnam. The tunnels negated many of the technological advantages that the United States and its allies possessed. Air power, artillery, and armor were all but useless against an enemy who could disappear underground. The tunnels also embodied the broader strategy of the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese Army: to avoid direct confrontation, to wear down the enemy through attrition, and to survive long enough to outlast the political will of the United States to continue the war. Operation Crimp was the first, but not the last, major effort to destroy the tunnel networks. Subsequent operations, including Cedar Falls in January 1967 and Junction City in February and March of 1967, involved even larger forces and more extensive tunnel clearing operations. Each time the results were similar. Allied forces would uncover vast sections of the network, capture supplies, kill or capture enemy fighters, and then move on, only to have the Viet Cong return and rebuild. The tunnels were never fully eliminated during the war. Some sections were destroyed, but others remained operational until the fall of Saigon in 1975. Today, portions of the Cu Chi tunnels have been preserved as a tourist attraction and war memorial. Visitors can crawl through widened sections of the tunnels, see reconstructed living quarters and command posts, and learn about the soldiers on both sides who fought in this unique and brutal form of combat. The tunnels are a reminder of the resilience of the Vietnamese people, the complexity of the Vietnam War, and the high cost paid by those who fought in it. The tunnel rats of Operation Crimp and the operations that followed faced a challenge unlike any other in modern warfare. They descended into darkness, not knowing what they would find, armed with little more than a pistol and their own courage. They fought an enemy who had every advantage, in a place where the usual rules of combat did not apply. Many did not survive. Those who did carried the experience with them for the rest of their lives. Their story is one of quiet heroism, of ordinary soldiers doing extraordinary things in the most difficult circumstances imaginable. It is a story that deserves to be remembered, not for glory or triumph, but for the simple, unadorned truth of what they endured and what they achieved in the tunnels beneath the jungles of Vietnam.